Drop that girl, Dracula, or this wooden knife will finish you off forever. I'm Eddie, what up?
Yo, Chris Spivey.
And today we're going to talk about Tomb of Dracula, Issue 10. His name is Blade. Here on Speechless. Hello and welcome to another run of Speechless, where we decided we want to talk about comic books again because we like doing that, and this is a particularly interesting run of comics to talk about. It's Marvel again. Yes, it's Marvel again. We're both Marvel fans. I think we've been pretty open about that on the podcast.
I think we can admit to them that we almost did the Suicide Squad run.
We
which was
did
in
we
DC.
did talk we did talk about doing Suicide Squad. We also talked about doing maybe Teen Titans, but Tomb of Dracula is it's an interesting bit of comics like history. It came at a weird time. In the 60s, there was the Comics Code. I think we talked about Comics Code before, but short version is that the Comics Code was a set of rules that all the comic book companies agreed to abide by, and they basically self-regulated the Comics Code Authority, which would pass or fail various comics and comic scripts. And one of the conditions of the original Comics Code was that no supernatural creatures like vampires and werewolves could be depicted.
And part of that was to destroy a relatively successful company, though, that was killing it with horror comics at the time.
Right, EC Comics, yes. At some point in time, we should probably do a whole episode about the Comics Code and how it came about, because it came about for bullshit reasons. It was enacted for bullshit reasons, and it fell apart because of bullshit reasons. So,
what about the seductions of innocent Eddie? We all know that it was true and accurate and not at all a load of bullshit.
It was entirely made up nonsense. It was a manufactured panic. And honestly, you can kind of just find replace comic book with video games, and it's still going on today. So,
but they told me that Batman and Robin were doing stuff, and that's why they introduced the Ant into the television series. They introduced Batwoman and Batgirl into the comics.
It's all true, actually. Because
I know
they thought that it was a homosexual relationship.
And then they dropped them both, and they rebooted both those characters later on.
Right. And now members of the Bat family are openly homosexual. So, ultimately, that was a win for history.
It only took way, way too fucking long.
Way too fucking long. So, in 72, that clause was written out. There are reasons that were presented, but really comes down to EC Comics was basically done, so they didn't need it anymore. And Marvel decided they were going to start producing some comics, some quote unquote horror comics, but differently. And one of them is a Tomb of Dracula, which features, yes, that Dracula.
Why did they choose Dracula, Eddie, and not like Vampire 86?
Because it's public domain. And the glib answer would be that therefore they don't own royalties, and therefore getting for cheap. But to be slightly more fair to Marvel, they had actually around this time, but slightly earlier than this time, a pretty successful run of comic adaptations of public domain works. So they had done some like well-known kid stories. I think they even did like the original Dracula, maybe, as a comic. I don't remember it off the head.
They did, but this was a different version of it. I also think they did
like
Prince Valiant. I feel like they did that one. That's maybe iffy, though.
Right. It's a weird part of Marvel's history that doesn't get talked about much, so it's a little vaguer. But they were trying to, frankly, get these into schools, right, as a way to kind of adapt well-known literature. I know they did Shakespearean plays, for example. They did one issue of Sherlock Holmes, stuff like that.
Have you read that issue of Sherlock Holmes?
No, I haven't, but I have read the DC version, which is okay.
I'm
Weirdly,
stunned by that.
it's just not bad. I also read the one where Batman teams up with Sherlock Holmes, which is a whole separate issue.
Did they quibble about who the greatest detective is?
They do, and Batman conceded as Sherlock Holmes because it was the '70s and Batman was a decent guy then.
What? You mean before he became Bat God and just became like Bat Dick 24/7?
Right? Yes. Speaking of Bat Dick, so Tomb of Dracula became very successful. But initially, they were a little skeptical about how well it was going to do. So they only released it bi-monthly, which is a pretty common tactic around this time period. That way, if they decided to cancel a series, it was unlikely the next issue would even started, let alone have to be canceled in the middle of production. So at most, they were probably just axing a script. And because it was the Marvel method, probably wasn't even that much. But certainly, Tomb of Dracula went through a number of writers. Uh, Surprisingly, the artist all the way through was consistent. That was Gene Colan, who's a fantastic '70s artist.
Yeah,
Uh,
exceptional.
but writes at this issue, or maybe it was the issue before this. I'm quickly checking. But Marv Wolfman became kind of the main writer for Dracula, and yes, it was
I
before this
think
one.
I think Marv Wolfman came in around issue 7, but he still had scripts from other people that he had to do, and it was shortly after those, I think, 2 issues that he got to start doing his own thing.
Right, because it is right around the issue before this and this one. He starts introducing his own cast. And that's usually a sign you can see a new lead writer coming on is when um, either old cast members get removed, new cast members get introduced, or both. In this case, he didn't really remove any of the previous cast members, but he did start adding new ones. And
Or
so,
they get a new suit of Iron Man armor.
yes, yeah. Well, actually, I take it. That's not entirely true because there was that one in Armor Wars. He got a lot of different suits of armor because that was toy mandated.
Well, before that though, those older suits that we saw were somewhat new writers, and also because, come on, the original Iron Man suit, nah.
And yeah,
Just
no, it's
so you mentioned Marv Wolfman. I'll stop giving you Iron Man gags. Why is Marv Wolfman so important?
Well, it's he's just a very prolific writer. He used to joke that part of the reason he helped to kind of reform the comics code because he otherwise wouldn't be able to allow it to be published under his own name because one comic company actually was afraid to use his real name because they thought it'd be a violation of the comic book code.
I know I read up on that, and that is brilliant that he used like Wolfman as a descriptor in the book as someone else's name, so they had to credit him on the cover. Oh,
Yep.
I
Hmm.
love it. I love when people have to adhere to the letter of the law, and you get to fuck them with it.
Yes, absolutely. Um, so he was mainly a writer at DC in the '60s. Tried to introduce a black hero, got fired by DC for doing so in Teen Titans. So he came over to Marvel and, unsurprisingly, tried to push the introduction of more black characters at Marvel. He was more successful there. He was part of a wave of writers coming in the early '70s who were all keen to show more diversity in the comics as a whole, but a lot of this ended up being the introduction of more black characters.
Because
Um,
they wanted to make it more representative of the world that they're in.
Specifically New York.
Which
New York.
and and to some extent, that was not necessarily done well, but it was
No.
done, which is a great starting point, given the struggles they had to go through to get to that point. And even have you mentioned how he lost his job at DC because people were giving him like small little side jobs since people weren't being credited yet, and he could
Mhm.
sort of trickle by. But that was the move to Marvel because that was enough money.
Right. Um, so uh, he's one of the co-creators of Blade along with Gene Colan. And so this is the first issue of his appearance. But definitely this is a very different Blade than what most people are probably expecting to see.
Yeah. So before we go into Blade, who else did Wolfman create?
You want to talk about Jack Russell, don't you?
I'm gonna. All right. So some insider info that we had nicely skipped over is that we'd recorded about 15 minutes of the first episode. This episode that you're listening to now, my entire system crashed. That computer died, so I ran around for 5 minutes to find my backup computer to now run on that. And previously, I made a whole bunch of Jack Russell jokes about Werewolf by Night because that was published the opposite month of Tomb of Dracula, and you will never hear those Jack Russell jokes because they've gone into the ether.
Right. But no, he's made a lot of characters. I think the run he's probably most famous for is when he rebooted the Teen Titans in the 80s, because he, at that point in time, was back at DC, and they wanted some of that sweet, sweet X-Men cash, and so they basically wanted him to do a Claremont-style comic book. So he got to do Teen Titans again, rebooted it with, I just blanked on the artist's name. Why did I do that? Perez. And very successful run. In fact, not only did it sell as well as X Men, but for a while sold slightly better than X Men for a few months.
Isn't that why it led
Um,
to the crossover?
yes, it led to the crossover, and also partially because both of them, because they're so popular, schools were getting concerns about the impact these comics have. Again, shades of the comic code. And so separately, both the X-Men and the Teen Titans ended up doing promotional uh, comics, mostly anti-drug comics, that they gave away free to schools. And so because both of those went through the same company, the people who licensed both of those teams were able to talk to the same people, and then they had a conversation, hey, let's do an X-Men Teen Titan crossover. But yes, so he is also the creator of Cyborg, another introduction of a black hero, because Marv Wolfman really loves to grind axes, as we pointed out.
He's also created Starfire, Raven, and Deathstroke.
Yeah. So most of what we now think of as Teen Titans is because of Wolfman and Perez.
And one of the greatest like villain slash anti-heroes ever in Deathstroke, which I'm assuming he probably took some of that ability to do from creating Dracula, who is a villain slash sort of anti-hero. If you
Well, that's well, I was gonna say, like,
look
this
through a
is a little
hazy fog.
right, right. It's the Tomb of Dracula is kind of an interesting run just historically because um, it is Dracula is the primary character. His name's in the title. He is the character you're going to see in every issue. He's not a hero. He's not a Punisher style anti hero either. Like, I could see a version if this was done in the 90s where we would have a very different Tomb of Dracula style comic, right? Um, Dracula is still a villain. Dracula is 100% a villain. Near the end of the run, I understand he got a little more muddled on that front because I think they were just struggling to come up with some of them. But at this stage, what's happened is the initial writers, um, which there were several of them, created up a small cast of vampire hunters, which Marv added to. But because Dracula's name's on the book, they can never actually truly defeat Dracula. So we get an interesting dynamic where the lead of the book is the villain, and we're following his thought or his plans, but also there are people that we more objectively want to root for, but we also know they can't win. Um, Kind of
And
the closest analogy I could think of is the Big Finish Master box sets.
hmm,
Derek Jacobi's doing a whole bunch of box sets as his version of the Master, and he's not redeemable. He's just a villain, but and he wins because it's his name on the box set. But how that ties into everything and the characters they introduced for that box set to have him go up against are where the tension kind of comes in.
and at the same time, Dracula can never truly win either. So it's a good
Right.
counterbalance between each other. Minor victories, but never a real like win.
Right, and so I guess the only other comic at the time contemporary that kind of does a similar thing is uh, the Fu Man, no, not Fu Manchu comic, the Shang Fu, the Fist of Kung Fu comic, because Shang Tzu is the lead of the comic, but his father is the licensed Fu Manchu, and then became a different name when they lost the license for Sax Romer. But so he can never entirely defeat the character they licensed. So it's a similar kind of tension of, but that one's a little more pretty straightforward. Like there is a titular hero that we follow, and we want him to succeed. This one is the titular character is not the hero. So yeah, it's a fascinating comic because it's in the 70s. It was bi-monthly, so each one is kind of sort of standalone. Here's at run issue 10 is when it starts to get a little more serialized. You see more plot threads drawn back from and pay forward at this point in time. But even then, they're not even like other Marvel comics. So you can pick up a comic because the assumption is you may not remember what happened 2 months ago.
Well, the other
So
part was this was specifically not supposed to overlap with superheroes, like, at all.
right.
And it was its own separate world until the sweet, sweet allure of cash overwhelmed them, and that's when, like, Spider-Man fought Dracula in the 75 or 76, I think.
Right, because and we will get to the actual issue, I promise. But there's a lot of interesting stuff here. Marvel was also trying to break into the magazine market because the loophole to the comics code was that they also defined what the parameters of creating a comic were, and magazines were not under those same restrictions. So, at simultaneous to Tomb of Dracula, they had a black and white magazine called Dracula Lives, which was their quote unquote adult comic. And every once in a while, or around the time that Marv comes on, plot threads from Dracula Lives start to show up in Tomb of Dracula and vice versa. So it is a slight cross promotion. And so Tomb of Dracula was really more Dracula's ongoing problems with those damn kids and their vampire hunter pals, whereas Dracula Lives is more about Dracula's backstory and history, and some of his private anguish. So it all blended in this kind of really interesting kind of multimedia thing that you're right became extremely popular. And so Dracula moved into the Marvel universe and got kind of deformed by the weirdness of being in a superhero universe. And so now we have shit like Dracula's castle is on the moon canonically, and he has an entire cadre of vampire people that he occasionally fights with, and sometimes they have superpowers.
And I love it so much. I love it. I love it. I recently even I reread the Avengers run where it was like the Vampire War and Dracula's
Oh
fighting the
God.
Avengers again. Love it. It is so utterly ridiculous and it's perfect. But like you're talking about Dracula on the Moon, so like Doctor Doom's armor is like lined with silver just to fuck with Dracula. It is the
Mm-hmm.
small little touches that you bring in a supernatural element, and Doom, who is sort of steeped in both worlds, is still prepared to fight whoever it is.
Right. So when we're going through this, these are at this time not actually part of the Marvel universe, and it kind of gets around that in the sense that a lot of the action takes place in Transylvania and London at this stage of the comic, so it's just not in New York. It's kind of their way around that. So they never were explicitly not part of the Marvel universe. That's why they were able to bring him in. But the intention is that this is, like you said, a separate continuity functionally.
And to touch on the superhero piece a little bit, the fact that Dracula loves Storm and considers Storm a peer. Just gonna leave that there. But to specifically root back to here, that's why Blade here is essentially like James Bond slash Shaft with knowledge about how to fight vampires, and is immune to vampire powers, but has no superhuman strength, no regeneration or anything. Just highly skilled professional. He's
And
a
at least,
bad motherfucker, if you would.
yes, shut your mouth. Just talking about Blade. Um, it is also implied, although this gets written out, that the glasses he wears are the reason why he's immune to the mind powers. But that was apparently a thread that got dropped pretty early on.
I like it better if he's just innately immune. That given the back history with like his mother being bitten by a vampire and then him having vampire enzymes. And
Right,
for people that are curious, the reason Blade got real superpowers, and I consider real superpowers like superhuman strength, regeneration, everything else, is because he was bitten by Michael Morbius, the living vampire, which was another loophole that Marvel used to have vampires. But that happened after the Blade movies were so infinitely successful. So you can
right,
thank Wesley Snipes for Blade being so prominent as he is now in comics, because before that, he'd pop up for a while, then disappear for 5 years, and then come back and disappear.
right. And that's actually how the Blade movies got made, is because the rights to them were basically cheap because no one was using the character. And so they got the rights for a song, and the movies became super popular. And so Marvel's like, let's make our own money off of this.
I can't
Like,
remember. Is Blade still the sheriff of like an X-Men town, or is that two now, like two iterations of X-Men ago?
I honestly don't know where he's at now. I know that during the Krakoa era, he popped up briefly because he was with I want to say Excalibur. X Men had a specific magic hunting team, and Blade was on that briefly.
Because Blade is technically a mutant, I think, is what he's classified now as.
Yes, technically he's a mutant. Yes, because why not?
Hey, mutants, I think they're almost classified as being born with your superhuman powers now, is how it becomes.
I
And
believe
Blade,
that's qualified. And since because his mother was bitten and he was born after his mother was bitten, ergo he is a mutant.
correct. It's not Terrigen Mist that made him into a superpowered being, or being bitten by a radioactive spider, or building an armor suit. Mutant.
Uh, Anything else we'll talk about Blade or Tomb of Dracula before we go into this issue specifically?
I could talk about Blade all day, Eddie. But if you want to get started, we can. I'm just gonna say, still fucking love Blade.
Yes, I agree. So we're going to start with issue 10. The release date was on April 17th, 1973. As a note, the cover date and the release date, we talked before, are different. The cover date is actually when the people are supposed to take the comic off the stand. It says July on the cover, and that's because it's supposed to be removed by July, but it was released in April. Written by Marv Wolfman, penciled by Gene Colan, inked by Jack Abel, colored by Petra Goldberg, lettered by Denise Vladimir, and edited by Roy Thomas. I believe Roy Thomas was the editor the entire time. But we start with two people who are running to
What?
the docks.
Wait.
Sorry.
You skipped the incredible cover of this
Oh, I did
issue,
skip the
Eddie.
cover. I
That
did skip the
cover
cover.
is
Sorry.
badass. I want like a poster of that on my wall.
Right. So the cover is Blade holding two wooden knives, one of which he's getting ready to throw by the blade at Dracula, who's holding a woman who is unconscious. And in the most 70s word balloony moments, Blade not only gives the line I gave at the beginning of the episode, but then continues, maybe your hot stuff back in Transylvania, but nobody messes around with Blade the Vampire Hunter. Uh, it's just so goddamn wordy. It's so wordy it even covers up part of the logo of the comic.
But it's beautiful, and it is so 70s.
It is. You could look at that comic and instantly know what decade that comic was drawn in.
And part of it is also almost an callback to the first episode, first issue of Tomb of Dracula, where Dracula is literally just Dracula on the cover, holding a blonde woman, much like that, facing you. So now
Right,
you have Dracula trying to almost flee with his victim and being chased by Blade.
right. And they're on a boat.
And I think that could have been Wolfman inferring that the dynamic of the comic is about to change. Because right around here is
Hmm.
where he got to start fully writing his own scripts and everything else without other people's input.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. I like that. So in the interior cover, a man and a woman are rushing to the docks to try to sneak aboard a ship in order to get married in America, because at this point in time, the comic is set in London. Well, it's set in England, but primarily in London, because as we all know, London and England are basically the same thing. They get attacked by three vampires who tell them that they will be turned into vampires. They will go to America as vampires to propagate something planned, something. It's a little vague.
What about still the beautiful artwork of seeing them transform? Just on that first page as they're coming down, you get the three different versions of them slightly
Mhm.
transforming, like full bat, sort of kind of transforming to maybe human bat, then like a human landing.
Yeah, and one thing we talked about it a bit when we did the Armor Wars run, but it's all coming here. It is the idea of thematic coloring rather than literal coloring is extremely prominent in the 70s comics. So like all of the vampires are kind of a blue to purple range, which also it's kind of because like if you look at the art, you know exactly what's happening is they're kind of this half bat, half human thing. But the way that it's colored, it kind of tries to take away some of the body horror of the moment, even though from the liner it's very clear that that kind of sickly transformation is absolutely intended by Colin.
Do you think they're doing that while they're since the comic book code is still there, they just can have some leeway with it? Do you think they're trying to do that to assuage any sort of negative feedback or reaction they may have received?
Absolutely. I believe that they're using coloring to kind of hide some of the horror elements of it. The eventual outcome of this leads to what has now become a weird trope in Marvel Comics until extremely recently of blood being colored black. Is that so they can hide the fact if it's black and not red, it's not quote unquote blood. And so for a long time afterwards, every time someone bled, they would bleed black in comics.
Hmm.
That's only been relatively recently they've actually gone to straight blood.
Now I understand where Chris Carter, creator of the X Files, got his idea about the black oil and stuff. Now, thank you. I was wondering about that all this time, and now I piece it together.
Yeah,
He owes Marvel money.
I mean, you joke, but there's a non-zero chance that may have actually been part of it. So the vampire, who call themselves Dracula's Legion, attack, and the couple fight back. But then we have the introduction of Blade and his huge, amazing half-page glory, who and again calls himself Blade. Blade repeats his name, the Vampire Killer,
It's
with two
called
exclamation
emphasis, Eddie.
points.
Whenever I go somewhere and I want to impress people, I go, Chris Pivey. Much like Bond, James Bond.
Right.
Blade.
What do you end it with two exclamation points? Is my question.
I do, but since we're on air, I'm not going to do it because I don't want to break someone's eardrum. By I, I learned that after having accidentally done that once before. I listened to it myself. I was like, that's way too loud. You just like tone that down, Spivey. So
That's how you broke the last computer, obviously.
yeah. Can we take a moment though to talk about how amazing it is? So we've got the boyfriend sort of running around, but she picks up and gets ready to fight vampires.
Yeah, with a looks like a crowbar or cane or something.
That's who's fighting. The boyfriend is nowhere to be seen. I so reading a comic from like the early '70s that makes me feel better, and it gives me an idea about who the writing team is. Because
Yeah,
normally you would have her sort of running off and the boyfriend fighting, and it
right.
is her in frame fighting vampires.
And it's not uncommon in Tomb of Dracula, but because there's a large supporting cast, I'm going to wait and talk about each character as they get introduced rather than going through all of them. But the comic started off strong on that front, so it's good to see it's continuing. Can we talk about Blade's outfit in this?
If you want to,
He's got this amazing green coat with wide 70s lapels, yellow sunglasses that cover the entire eyeball. He's got a bandolero of red stakes and a leather belt with blue pants and black boots. It's just amazing.
you don't want to talk about the open V-neck that is so open you can only see the tips of the white shirt. And it's all chest, baby, shaved, no less chest.
Yes, yes, he is a sexy, sexy vampire hunter.
And part of it that I think I've read somewhere is that this version of Blade is also a riff on Luke Cage, and I would have to imagine Shaft. I'm trying to remember now when Shaft came out, but it feels like Shaft
Yeah,
completely through and through.
I mean, the rise of Marvel of black characters in Marvel in the '70s directly parallels blaxploitation, right? I mean, so there's
Yeah,
a lot of tropes in those movies that end up getting emulated in Marvel in the same way that the kung fu comic I mentioned was the rise of kung fu movies. So I mean, Marvel was absolutely interested in emulating what was popular culture at the time. I mean, we have joked in the past about the Thing's wrestling career, but part of the reason was because wrestling was popular in the '80s. So
which is also what led to Power Fist and Iron Man teaming up, Iron Fist teaming up as a team because they were riffing off both of those rising different genres, and they combined them into one comic. Because by
right,
themselves they started to not work, and when they put them together, it spiked back up for success.
right, because reading those original comics are actually really fun because it is both of them are kind of bringing the tropes of their own media into it, and then they start clashing, and that's where a lot of the interest comes in because they both approach problems from their media's perspectives, and it's not working because the other set of media tropes are in play. So there's a lot of fun of confusion around that front that leads to some really fun comics. So Blade kicks a whole bunch of ass with his wooden knives. Actually, I don't think they're yes teak wood. They're teak wood knives. Clarified
All
here.
right. you know I was going to do this sometime during this run, so I'm going to start it off the top. You, as a person with a deep, deep knowledge of vampires and vampire hunters, and having created numerous to millions of different like clans and other groups,
It's,
vampire clans. Let me clarify that in case anyone wants to get So Eddie, what type or what category of vampire hunter would this blade fall under according to the Onyx Path stuff?
well, I mean, uh, if you're talking about World of Darkness, he's just kind of a normal mortal. But if you're talking about Chronicles of Darkness, he's more Hunter the Vigil, because he has a very strong code, and he follows that code. But so what's interesting about the vampires in the Marvel universe is that they are very, very, very traditional vampires. So a wooden stake kills them, although that gets by issue one of this comic rewrites that particular weakness to as long as the stake stays in their body. If you remove the stake, then they come back to life because some character, I'm not going to mention any names, removed a Dracula stake, and that's how all of this stuff started.
Okay, these tradition. I promise this will likely be my close to last time doing this. Then
I don't
what
believe that at all.
clan would these stereotypical vampires fall into?
Well, I mean, the problem is that because they have such stereotypical weaknesses, they don't quite map to any of the of darkness vampires, or even the Curseborn vampires for that matter. Although slightly better to Curseborn vampires.
Eddie,
Um,
you've
yes.
mentioned Curseborn. I have no idea what that is.
You don't know about Curseborn? I mean, you should know about that. You helped consult on Curseborn, Chris. You know all
I
about
don't remember it. I know I know like Vampire the Masquerade. I know Vampire Sabbat. I know the Hunter books. I know the Mummy books. But Eddie, what is Curseborn?
Curseborn is the horror game, most recent horror game created by Onyx Path Publishing. So rather than the Of Darkness games, which are licensed by Paradox Publishing, this is our whole new creation and step into horror. So if you're interested, you can go to chrisborn.com to find out more about that and pick up and pre-order the book or order it depending on when you're listening to it. I mean, years from now, maybe out. I don't know. I'm not sure yet.
So if I go back then to the old school ones, would a one of these vampires be sort of a mix of a Ventrue, Gangrel, and Nosferatu?
I mean, yeah, kind of. Certainly the powers of persuasion. At this point, because I'm trying to keep it to just what vampire or what Dracula has shown up to issue 10. Because I actually did read the previous 9 issues. He does have uh, strong charisma and mesmeric powers, so the venture part certainly applies to that. But also, he does turn into a bat and mist. So those are the more gangrel components of things. So I mean, he's a caitiff basically.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
He does like turning into a bat a lot. All right, we can get back to the main issue. I just wanted to touch on the actual gaming mechanics of it because if we
Yes.
didn't, people would ask us,
So, someone asked, right?
why didn't you ask Eddie about vampires? Eddie knows everything about vampires. Like I know,
You know vampires too.
but I am
Uh,
not he who should be Sir Eddie Webb.
so for a couple of issues, Blade just kicks a whole bunch. He basically schools 3 vampires. Stabs, straight up kills one with the knife. Second vampire attacks and he clocks him, and then kills him with a stake. And the third one tries to fly away, turns to a bat and fly away. Uh, uh, and Blade jumps after him, grabs him, and then stabs him. And again, like it's a close up on the stab, but again, because we're still in the early days of the comics code, the actual stab is like more rendered like a flare, and then actually stabbing into flesh. You can't see the flesh at all. It's just the narration tells you what happened.
So I will honestly admit I have never read this before. This is my first time
Really?
reading Tomb of
Oh,
Dracula.
okay.
And when I saw the stabbing scenes as we were talking about, it instantly reminded me of Bilbo versus the spiders in the 70s animated version. Because they couldn't show that because it was aimed for kids and it was still in the
Right.
70s and the spiders were creepy and scary looking. So they had to show it to you, but then it became like a big flash of light and they would spin out of the screen. And that is what it instantly reminded me of.
Right, right. Um, and but the comic is still pretty dark because the third vampire changes back to his human form, and you find out that he was a teenager. Um, uh, the narration says 18, but he is accused of being a child by the next character who enters the scene, who is Harker.
Be
Uh, yep, go
Before you
ahead.
go into that too much, I want to take a moment to point out that all right, so he stabbed him and he's killed him, but we see him pull the knife out of him.
Mhm.
So the rule that you discussed earlier about removing a stake from someone, does that only apply to Dracula? Is there like an age where it has to be?
Yes, so it is implied that, well, I mean, to be honest, plot relevant vampires can come back from this, really. Because initially it is only Dracula, although in around issue 6 or 7, there's another vampire that's hidden, that's trapped in a bottle, that's able to come back. But then she dies again. So it seems like only Dracula can actually come back from being staked, but that rule gets horribly rewritten throughout the life of vampires in the Marvel Universe.
And for anyone that's a Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan, it is interesting to note one of the first things they did for that show was to decide all their vampires returned to dust to avoid this very issue. Because there's a horror associated with seeing your hero kill someone and then leave the body there to be found later and, I don't know, buried, cremated, whatever.
Except that in issue 3, a vampire did turn to dust when it was killed. And then now they stopped turning to dust.
Hmm. All right, so maybe it's an age thing because you're about
Maybe.
to get into how long they've been vampires. Maybe it's an age thing.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Because these are relatively young vampires. That's something that we don't know at this stage of the comic, but we'll find out a bit later. He gets accused of this by Quincy Harker. So Quincy Harker is the child of the Harkers from the original Dracula novel. So Harker is in his 70s, 80s. In one of his previous vampire hunts, he lost the use of his legs, so now he's in a wheelchair. Is specifically a self-driving wheelchair, which has additional buttons on it, which we will get to.
Was that vampire
Um,
fight against Dracula?
yes, yes. And he's here with his daughter, which I don't remember her name off the top of my head. I think we get to it in a minute. Nancy. Anyway, but we find out that Harker had gotten a call that Blade was in town. He got that call last issue. Uh, Literally, Blade was not mentioned. It was just 3 panels of Harker getting a call and going, "Huh, I need to go look into this," and that's it. And then the entire rest of the issue was Dracula doing other stuff. So it's not really relevant to this plot.
Hmm. So now that you said that, how are you enjoying the writing of a '70s comic versus the more recent comics that you're reading with Dracula? Because you talked about him on the moon, so I'm assuming you've read some recent vampire stuff. So we've got this '70s version of vampire versus the now we'll say 2020s.
Honestly, this is frankly a bit grittier, right? It's like I said. I mean, the Blade having killed a teenager is something that Harker admonishes, but Blade points out that he doesn't care, although he says it by this dialogue. Frankly, I don't give a flying hoot. He was a stinking vampire. So, I mean, you have to work within the constraints you got here. Because you know that's not what Blade actually said, right?
He's not wrong though. He is a vampire. He's already dead. And I don't think they introduced a bit about they do in Doctor Strange later, where I think if you kill Dracula, supposedly everyone he's turned will turn back to humans or whatever.
Right. That was in the 80s or run because there was an entire spell that if you cast a spell and then kill Dracula, it would eradicate all vampires. Spoiler, did not work. Uh, but
Because Doctor Strange's brother, I think, was infected, become a vampire. I actually owned that run.
yes. At this stage, if you are bitten by Dracula, you become a vampire. So There's a bit of the zombie film vibe of, well, he's been bitten, so we can't trust them anymore, right? And so any characters can become Dracula's minions pretty quickly. That again, that rule's very inconsistently enforced. It becomes more consistent under Wolfman. I will say all that. A lot of the inconsistency I'm talking about is because they had four writers over 9 issues.
I hate that rule, by the way. That makes 0 sense. Given the
So
number of
one
vampires, how
biting,
many people they would
yeah,
bite,
right.
it's an in some game.
It's not a great rule. I agree, but it is. They're trying to. Wolfman's trying to make some more consistency for the rules. Um, and so what we kind of have here is that, and this is how the Tomb of Dracula comic keeps momentum, is that the vampire hunters are not all on the same page. So Harker is been doing this for his entire life, and he feels the relentlessness of it, and also he very specifically wants to kill Dracula. Uh, um, he's not a vampire hunter in general. He specifically wants to hunt down Dracula and kill him. Blade is just a vampire hunter, and so from his perspective, I have killed 3 vampires. This is a good thing. From Harker's perspective, I cannot follow them to get to Dracula. Therefore, this is a bad thing.
So the institutionalization versus the individual.
Right, and in a lot of when vampires do show up in modern Marvel comics, it's usually kind of okay. We're all pretty much on the same page. Vampires are bad. Let's kill them, and it becomes just kind of let's murder people. They're already dead. We're cutting it to peace. Whereas here, it's a lot more personal, and the stakes are more personal. And so as a result, again, there's a grittiness and a tension here that's interesting. Again, through the lens of balderized comics code appropriate comics.
Well, come on. We all know vampires are bad. Look at Baron Blood and how much even Captain America hates that guy.
Parablood's an asshole. It also has a bat for a head.
um,
Uh,
no, but the banter between them is great. And like the call me Mr.
yes,
Blade after he sort of insults him a little bit. And he does call him Mr. Blade for the rest of our conversation.
right. And the other bit of tension is, which more from other comics, is that a lot of Harker's hunting skill is based around technology. He prefers trying to get the best technology to try to defeat Dracula and or his minions. So that he has like stuff in his wheelchair. He invents new gadgets, and Blade's much more. I have a wooden knife. That's all I need, which is very different from the Blade we know now.
Yeah. So what I did notice when I was reading it, and I'm going to point it out now because I think I can even point out again whenever we continue doing these, is that Blade is referred to with like a savage instinct in there. Like right
Mm,
away in one of the word bubbles, already showing you some of the problematic language they're going to use associated with black characters. While I'm giving them kudos for trying to introduce strong black characters, I'm also noting some of the differences that we can now highlight more specifically in the language that they've chose to use.
sure. And also, at this stage, a lot of black characters talk like they're in Shaft. So
They
they're going to
talk like
use
they want to be in Shaft.
right, fair. Um, but we have seagrams and sharpen up your wooden nickels dig. I mean, it's that kind of stuff, So
It's how a white person would envision a black person talking when there aren't white people around.
correct, correct. Uh, um, Now I will say like Edith is his daughter's name. I remember now. Edith and Quincy both kind of admonish Blade, but given the fact that Quincy is a much older man, and Edith grew up in a sheltered environment, it can be read as they just don't understand his instincts. And Quincy even says, in his own way, he's effective. So they don't bury Blade. It is very much we have the same goal, but we have very different methodologies.
That's one way to look at it, but I also look at it as an older white man telling a young black man what he should and should not be doing.
Sure. And that's one of the reasons why I think this, in a way, ages well, is because uh, when this was first written, we had followed Quincy for a few issues, so probably the intent was Quincy as the audience character we recognize coming in and telling this new character he's doing it all wrong. But it's now aged so that way, frankly, Blade has a lot of very valid points. And Marv wrote this so that way both those perspectives can be seen. So, like, Quincy comes across as someone who's too soft on vampires, and his romantic notion of how vampire hunting works is endangering him and his daughter.
Hmm.
So then we cut to a ship where a whole bunch of uh, British kids with meaningless titles are squandering their family fortune and basically just having a huge ass party. And that is because they have invited Dracula to come to their party. And
Before
before, I mean, before we even get to that point, like, there's a few things I want to go through, but like, that's kind of the high point. Um, uh, so they're introduced by his manservant Clifford Graves. And I made a joke earlier about who's the asshole who let Dracula go free. It's him, Clifford Graves. Clifford Graves is the reason why this whole comic started. Because
before we
Clifford
get to him
Graves,
though,
yeah, yeah.
I want to, because when they do something I do that I like, I want to stop and take a beat.
Oh,
They
sure.
literally introduce another character of color aboard the boat, and they give two full panels of that character.
Hmm.
So that is, once again, they're leaning and showing like more liberal leanings for comics, and that is huge. And we're in the early '70s now, and they're starting to take these pubescent steps towards it.
Yeah, and he's wearing a suit and he's carrying glass, so he's very clearly one of the party, not a servant, not an assistant. No, that's fair. But Clifford Graves was the friend of another character we'll meet, Nathan Drake. Not Nathan Drake, different Drake.
You sure
Um,
he's not an archaeologist that goes around punching
yeah,
people and stealing stuff?
yeah, and is secretly Spider-Man. No, um, uh, uh, Drake, who is the descendant of Dracula, inherited Dracula's castle, and so Clifford Graves became friends with him because Drake was rich and tried to get control over Dracula's castle so they could turn it into a museum slash tourist trap. And thought, I will take this stake that I found in Dracula's corpse and use it to kill my friend so I can gain control of everything, because that's how inheritance law works, apparently. And then release Dracula. Dracula turns Graves into his manservant.
Wait, Eddie. Out of the
Yes,
array of tools and implements he can use, the only possible murder weapon, literally only one, in a castle, is going to be the stake in Dracula.
yes, yes.
Okay.
Um, it should be noted that Graves is not a smart man. Um, because he also thought that by killing Drake, that Drake's fiance would then immediately fall in love with Graves, because that's how women's affections also work. So Graves was not working from a good premise to begin with.
It, it's like Highlander. When I slay you, I get all of your quickening. So it's all your power, all your money, and everything all goes to me.
Right, right, exactly. But yes, just Count Dracula just appears at this party, and he starts playing. I'm like, no, I'm the descendant of the original Count Dracula. Just call me Vlad. I'm not really a vampire. That's just some old family myth. And
He
so
doesn't.
just kind of playing it off.
He doesn't tell them to call him Vlad. We don't get that yet. He's playing it off. He's like deflecting all their questions and saying, "Yeah, it's like a blood disease, and this and that." There's only
Right.
one specific person. He says, "Call me Vlad."
Oh
Too. And
yes,
we're not
sorry, yes.
we're not there
We're
yet.
not there yet.
We're,
We're not
hey
there yet.
baby, Vlad.
And of course, all of the attractive young women are flocking around him, and he's like, "No, no, I can't fly." Instead of blood poisoning, and then the blonde woman who is hanging off of the man who's running the party, he goes over and starts flirting with her, and he's the one to say, "You can call me Vlad," and she keeps going, "Gosh, gosh, oh my gosh." Um, which gives you a very specific insight into her intellect level.
Oh god. Yeah.
And then Graves is like, "Why don't you just murder them all, Master? You can destroy them all." And he's like, just calm the fuck down, Graves. Jesus Christ.
But we get the best bit, Eddie, where he talks about how important, influential, and powerful these people are, and how they're writers. It literally starts with the word writers. They're influential and powerful. Thank you, thank you. I am influential and
Writers,
powerful.
actors, even princes. All men of importance, and all fools. So take the good with the rough the smooth.
That's all right. If an immortal superpowered being thinks I am powerful, then I'll take that compliment.
Right. He calls them all weaklings, effeminate fops, and mindless females, which is the most Ferengi thing I've ever heard. So basically his plan is he wants to try to manipulate them all into doing his bidding so he can start to seed himself through society, because after about 9 issues of just murdering random women in the street, he actually wants to come up with a plan now.
Mm.
So what's interesting is because Graves is still on the old plan. So let's just randomly murder people. That's fun. And Dracula's like, no, I have a new plan now. You're stupid for thinking the old plan was good. But it was your plan, Master. Shut up. It's very much the vibe that's happening here.
It's almost like Dracula saying I have better writer now. Is that what you're trying to
Yes.
infer without saying it?
It's almost like, okay, now we're issue 10. Maybe we should actually do something with this comic beyond just murder the attractive woman of the week. Or of every other month, as in this case. So Dracula's room is just opposite of the woman that he was flirting with. And he calls her charmingly and deliciously naive, which she thinks is a compliment.
He put intelligent in there first, and she said, "No one ever calls me that."
They're only fools. There's a it's like just pitched just below Doctor Doom level occasionally, but I still appreciate.
It feels very, I think we can both say, heavily Hammer Films influenced, hands
Yes,
down. Like there's no question
100%,
about where it came from.
100%. And so he takes her back to his room for a nightcap, and then we cut to a closed door with a screaming sound. Again, very much implying what happened. And then next we have Graves carrying her body. He's like, what should I do with her? And he tells Graves to watch her because he wants her blood was delicious. He may want to come back for a snack later. I want to remind you that if you bite someone, they become a vampire. And Dracula's like, yeah, just you, mortal human, I've given no power to whatsoever. Watch this woman who's about to become a vampire and keep her safe.
You don't think that he made Graves into a ghoul?
According to the way Graves is portrayed, he has no special abilities. Graves is just mesmerized.
That's sad.
Yeah. Dracula's plan is not great. So he goes to the captain of the ship and says, "You can call me Death," which is not my official name. My name is Dracula, but you can call me Death. She can call me Vlad. You can call me Death. And so he literally kills the captain and just grabs the wheel of the ship and takes it through his own words, a course through hell itself. I love this comic so much.
Oh god! But it's the
Um,
scene. It's the panel after that, though, where you see everyone being thrown asunder. It's
yes.
beautiful because it's a nice
Yes,
parallel to
because
see him.
the ship comes to a sudden stop because that's how ships work. You can just put brakes on.
Come on, you, how many people in the '70s don't know that?
Right. Um, so he then turns to Mist, and then he tells them that they're all spineless worms under his contempt. And it reveals that he's a vampire. And so, of course, they shoot him because they would have guns, obviously, as writers and whatnot.
All right, that's an interesting question now, because now that we're specifically putting it more in, we'll say London. What is the
Right.
gun law in London, Eddie, around 1970?
I think it's. I want to say that this is when I think guns were curtailed at this point, but I'm not 100% sure. I know that I know that they had lax gun laws for quite a long time. It's our perception of them not having guns is from a historic perspective relatively recent. But I think it was after World War II that it happened.
Okay.
But that said, you can still have private licenses for weapons, and B, they're rich, so the laws don't apply to them.
True. And so we watched Foyle's War last night because it's a great series that we've continued to watch.
Mhm.
And last night was the first real time that just random civilians had guns and they're breaking them out. So that was
Right,
weird. And then this morning, to parallel that, was seeing this place that's primarily in London. We're using London to describe all of Europe now because we're in the
right,
70s in this comic, and see
yes,
like pull out a gun and shoot somebody.
right. Um, so I mean, these are Americans writing British stuff, so take it for what you want. So they, um, it's apparently 22, even though that looks like a 38 to me. I'm pretty sure it's 38.
They're comic book writers; they probably don't even know. And the
Right,
fact that they're talking about how can you shake off a 22? A 22 is essentially, this is my Americanness right here for you, a granny
right,
killer. Like,
yeah.
you're pissing people off with a 22, much less the undead lord of vampires.
And Dracula even calls him out. It's like, you actually believe that toy can hurt Dracula? The Prince of Evil? Lord of Darkness? Dracula?
Oh,
He's not really gun. That's a fucking small gun, dude. It's like, no, he has to just keep giving himself titles to throw it in this guy.
but it's beautiful when he throws him over the boat and you see the same sort of scream. It's the exact same scream letters from when Dracula took the woman into his room.
Yep. Mhm. Right. And so, Dracula's then, so cool, now that I got rid of this guy, we can now talk about my evil plan. Um, and then, as that's happening, a smaller boat comes up, and we see Blade in a wetsuit.
Because he's fucking James Bond.
He is James Bond. So now it's like, all I need is my knife. And now these panels, what he also needs is scuba gear and a harpoon gun. But to be fair, the harpoon gun is to get him onto the boat.
And it's great. And as soon as he gets on the boat, his first thing is, I need to get rid of the scuba suit.
It's too tight. Gotta see my chest.
Once again, completely shaved. So I assume the shaved chest makes him a better fighter, is what it is. Because all those hairs would
Sure.
slow you down when you're moving.
Right, because it gives you +1 to your dexterity when you make dodges.
But it's a
Um,
beautiful action scene of him getting onto the boat.
yeah, yeah, and of course, in '70s comic style, he has to talk to himself the entire time.
Well, when you're a bad motherfucker, that's what you do, Eddie. I thought you knew that.
And he's going to scratch one big daddy vampire.
Do you know when they actually started using brown to represent black people in comics instead of the colors they were using before, which was like sort of a slate gray, I think?
It was between the '60s and the '70s because I know when I was reading the Teen Titan run in the late '60s, they were still using that slate gray.
Okay.
So it would have been, if this is '73, it probably would have been like right around 1970. Um, so Dracula has explained his plan that we don't get to see, and so they would do as he commands or suffer his eternal wrath. The wrath of the living dead. Choose now, fools! Now! Now! Just you have to say it 3 times to make sure that they understand. Just tell them what you're gonna tell them, and then tell them after you told them.
And we get that same other person of color breaks it across to fuck with Dracula, and it works.
Yeah, yeah. Again, and to be clear, this is a man with a kind of a Middle Eastern head wrap, but he pulls out a Christian cross. So it's maybe accidentally inclusive, but it really really works. And he's the only one who's actually stood up to Dracula so far.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the other guy shot him in the face with a gun, but
Well, that was stupid. That is what that
yeah,
was. There's something else for it. But this time, the characters actually colored better than they were in the first panels where they're presented. In the first
yeah.
panels, they were still sort of that slate gray color.
Let me double check real quick. Um, I think that may have been color corrected. Oh, you're right. It was slate gray. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, now that's actually brown color. And so I should say that at this stage of Tomb of Dracula, just seeing any vampire who sees the cross is repelled. You don't have to believe in it. You don't have to have any faith. It doesn't have to be holy. Just simply seeing the, or even having the shadow of the cross fall over you is enough to push you away. So,
I'm more of a fan of the Doctor Who approach to it, where it just needs to be something that you have a strong belief in, regardless of what it is.
Curse of Fenric has always shaped my belief in how this should be handled.
Yeah.
So yes,
And
you can repel a vampire with the communist pin. Why not?
if that's your thing.
Right.
But it's true. That's how it should work. It should be based on the person and their belief of whatever that thing is. So it could be good belief, it could be bad belief, but if it's strong enough, should repel the vampire.
Right. Graves is still trapped in the room, and he's like, "Oh, Dracula's in trouble. I should go do something about it. I need to figure things out because I need to think calmly about this." And then the woman knocks him the fuck out, and she's like, "I have to go to my love." So meanwhile, the apparently only competent person in the party is like holding the cross out while everybody else tries to jump on Dracula and find a stake. Because that's the thing you just have at parties, right? You just have stakes
That
lying around.
that's your thing. It's not the fact that people just know that you kill a vampire by staking them in the heart. That's common knowledge
They've
across the
watched Hammer
board.
horror films. I mean, who hasn't?
Mm. This is back when that would be in the theater somewhere. It's not like they could go and just say, "I want to stream Hammer horror films today," and watch them all day.
See, okay, so I actually buy this because they know that you put a stake through a vampire. I feel like that's pretty common knowledge, but they don't know he can change into mist because that's what happens immediately next. Is like he just disappears. So that they don't have encyclopedic knowledge of vampires. They remember this one thing they saw once.
All right, I'll let it go. The crossing, I have no problem with because that seems to be like that would almost be common knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
All right,
Right. Dracula disappears, changes the mist, comes back. He demands an ultimatum from them, and then Blade appears, goes never, and Dracula says Blade with two exclamation points and a question mark.
it would only be better if they knew the future and he got to shout at Dracula. Some motherfucker's always trying to ice skate uphill. That
Right.
would have been perfect.
Or knowing that Blade would eventually have a series if he shouted Blade's name in the logo of Blade's comic. And so Dracula knows about Blade killing his three soldiers, as he calls them. They were good men. They didn't possess my speed, my strength, or my cunning. So we do know there were weaker vampires. So that gives us some of the answer we were talking about earlier. And so he attacks Blade to try to get revenge.
One of the
And
things I
Blade,
really love about Dracula they're showing here is that he loves to transform to his different versions of himself and just not always
yes,
walking around in a human form. Love it. It is so many tactical advantages to it, and we get to see it displayed throughout the comic.
yes, because in the course of 3 pages, he changes to mist, he changes back to human form, then he changes to bat, then he changes back to human form.
It's beautiful.
And each time, it's a little different. Like at one point, he's just a bat with his head and a little bit of his collar. But then another time, you see kind of the intermediary steps as he grows back to his human form. You see the bat, and then above it, you see kind of the outline of the half bat form, and then above that, you see the fully colored Dracula image. So Gene Colan is not doing the same. He's always mixing up how that looks. But you're right; it's a very dynamic fight scene, not just in the composition, but also the fact that Dracula aggressively uses his powers.
Hmm. Now, the part I'm really
Also,
curious
punches the fuck out of Blade too. So I mean,
that's where I was going to go is how strong is Dracula? And because given Blade is still just a highly trained human,
mhm.
how strong is Dracula? Because we know he's
So
superhumanly strong, but
yes, in previous issues, he repeatedly made comments to, "I'm only I am strong enough to open this door, or to, in one case, like put a metal plate onto a pit." So implies that he is above human strength, but not like Hulk or Thing level strength.
Okay. Because I know in more recent iterations, now that he's become part of the Marvel Comics, he's able to stand toe to toe and kick Colossus's butt by himself, strength wise.
Right, right,
So that's putting him in
um,
75 to 100-ton range.
right. Which would have just murdered Blade when he punched him.
Yeah. This for obliterated him in this version.
Right. But if I'm understanding the timeline of this comic correctly, Dracula has been alive for like maybe a month or two through all the way to issue 10. So it could be argued he's still recovering from his recent death.
Hmm. Okay.
Um, so Blade kicks him, and we see the buttons on Dracula's shirt, so it's a little vague, but it looks like he kicked him in the junk.
But you couldn't show that, though, in the comic
Right,
back then.
right.
Eddie,
Um,
if you're undead, if someone kicks you in the junk, would that work?
I don't know, man. I mean, presumably, if you still have nerves, you would still have those nerves there, so probably.
All right. There's a science to it that I don't understand, but I will not think.
Right.
I will not
A
use my
lot of
time this
this.
morning thinking about Dracula's junk.
Right. So Dracula tries to jump Blade, and Blade swings out of the way, which leads to one of my favorite exchanges: is Dracula saying in three separate bubbles, "I have lost all patience with you, Blade. You are no longer a mere annoyance to me." What, you moved? Which is peak Dracula. I'm going to soliloquy at you and then get really mad that you didn't stand there and listen to my soliloquy while I attack you, because that's what you're supposed to do in these kinds of fights.
During the course of this fight, though, while Dracula is going to get the upper hand and win, look at how well Blade is sitting up against the Lord of Vampires,
Yeah.
who has been existing for over 500 years by himself without Harker or the rest of the organization.
And I mean, to his credit, throughout this whole fight, he has used just that wooden knife. And Dracula again, changes. He falls over the edge, changes to a bat, flies back over to try to grab Blade again. Um, and he's about to take out Blade, but the woman he accidentally turned into a vampire shows up and interrupts him. And he's like, "No, no, I'm busy. I'm in the middle of killing this guy. Would you just leave me alone?" And Blade takes advantage. So he and uh, specifically because the other, it's a little vague what actually happens here, but it looks like because the other people see that she has been converted into a vampire, they no longer follow him because Blade says whatever hold you had in these people is gone. That's a little vague as to how that actually happened.
Hmm.
But then Dracula just like, "Cool. Well, I guess I failed, so I'm gonna turn to a bat and leave." Bit
It's
vague.
it's this contingency plan that was already in action that I love that you're about to get to. Like this,
Right.
regardless of what everyone said, how do you stop what's about to happen? Like everybody said,
Right.
I'm in Drac.
Right. And we get to the last page where it's just like, "Oh, my servant was setting explosives, by the way." He wasn't. He was guarding the woman in the cabin.
No,
He was setting explosives before all this started.
he says a ship captain is doing it
Oh, no, you're right. I thought it was Graves that was doing it.
because
No, you're right. You're right.
I think he turned him into a vampire.
Myself of a ship's captain sets explosives. You're right. No, that's bad. Apologies. Um, which just explain the ship's captain moment beyond just Dracula wanting to go for a ride. But then, Graves is like, "Hey, master, so, can you come save me?" And he's like, "Nope, you suck. I'm out." "You are a incompetent idiot, Graves, and you have outlived your usefulness. Farewell, Graves." And then, boom. As Blade manages to rescue everyone except for Graves. and the ship explodes, and that's it. That is the end of the issue.
It's why you never work for a villain. My question though is the blonde a vampire or not? And if she is, what happens to her before, as the ship's getting ready to explode? Does Blade stab her? Does she blow up in the explosion? Does she turn into a bat and fly off? Will she return in like issue 20?
Right. So it is also vague because she is covering her face when Blade's telling everyone to go over the side. But the last panel, all of the heads in the water are colored as kind of a blue gray. So we don't know if she actually went over the overboard or not. But the previous page, she's talking about Dracula, my love. I'm yours, take me. But it's implied that a new element enters the scene, one of Dracula's own creation. So um, it's a little. I mean, maybe she was just mesmerized, but um, maybe she wasn't turned into a vampire. But previously, anyone who got bit by a vampire turned into a vampire. So again, it's inconsistent. Maybe she was just mesmerized.
So yeah, that's the part that threw me off a little bit because that one I didn't get.
Uh, and I mean that's honestly, I mean, as much as I love the Tomb of Dracula run, how vampirism actually works is largely up to just whatever's plot interesting. I do see. The problem is conceptually, I like the idea of we don't know how all the rules work because we're still learning as we go along.
Yeah.
But the problem is that several characters in the comic present themselves as experts on this subject, including Dracula. And so it's like, it totally works this way, and then it just doesn't later on. So it's not like we're discovering the rules as we go along. It's that we're typically told what the rules are, and then the rules are violated. So it is comics.
Regardless, though, as a first-time read of this, I loved it. I loved it.
It is. Is it as 70s as you hoped it would be?
It is. In fact, next year I may dress up as Blade for my Halloween costume. The 70s Blade, not the cool-looking Blade, but the 70s Blade.
You have to get the fro in, though. That's a very important part of it.
I could grow that by next year. Jill would hate it, though. Hate it, probably.
Sure, probably. Okay, totally do.
And I wonder if I could convince Zora to dress up like Dracula.
Oh, that'll be amazing. So yeah, so that's it. That's issue 10. Obviously, next week we're going to talk about issue 11, the Voodoo Man issue.
What's it called, though, Eddie? What's the name
It's
of the
called the
issue?
Voodoo Man. That's actually the title of the issue. It's called the Voodoo Man with a hyphen. The Voodoo hyphen Man.
Because when I look at the red box here, it says Next, Voodoo over London. I guess it's not the title so much as just a description of what to expect.
Right. Well, and that's something else. Like what the title of each issue is something. What the next issue calls it, what it's called in the box, what it's called in the cover. They're all usually completely different. So generally, historically, we settle on whatever the title is on the credits page, and that is what it is called. Is the Voodoo Man. We're gonna have lots to talk about in an issue.
Something in my soul is telling me that Voodoo, written by a bunch of white dudes in the 70s, is not going to be something I'm going to be excited about.
It's even worse than you think.
Because I'm assuming they'll also not get into the nuances between like voodoo and hoodoo and the different things like that.
Oh no. But if people want to talk to you about voodoo, Chris, where do they find you online?
You could find me in the Darker Studios Discord, where I would happily talk about Blade for endless hours. Or if you want to like come and talk to me on Blue Sky, I would also have Blade talks on Blue Sky. What about you?
You can find me at on the Darker Hue Discord as well. Again, I would love to talk about Tomb of Dracula actually because it's a comic I don't think gets talked about enough. But also you can find me at pugsteady.com. Where you buy all of my stuff, and if you're interested in buying games about dogs, you can find me those at realmsofpugmire.com. And so with that, we will see you next issue 11.